Thanks for staying with us here on Live Now from Fox. I'm your host, Christina Evans. As promised before break, we're going to be diving a bit deeper into that President Zelensky as they clashed in that heated to break down what this means moving forward for the two nations. I want to bring into the conversation now Brian Sobel, political analyst, to help us understand. Brian, thanks so much for being with us here on Live Now from Fox. Of course, watching those moments as we played it out just a minute ago for folks who didn't see it yesterday, it was shocking to see that heated conversation that happened in the Oval Office. What are your initial thoughts?
Well, Christina, good to see you. So much to unpack when you think about it. We haven't seen a scene like that in the Oval Office, maybe ever. Most politics are done behind the scenes, and how that played out yesterday really was not beneficial for Ukraine, but it wasn't beneficial for the United States. We have allies all over the world who watched that and couldn't have been pleased by what they saw. And I'd make a couple of observations. You know, President Zelensky was argumentative. He pushed back on the president, but a couple of things to consider. You had the president of the United States, the vice president of the United States, you had the secretary of state, and then you had a president of Ukraine speaking in a second language. And when you speak in a second language, I don't care how good you are, you're not very good at nuance. And he didn't read the room very well. That's very clear. But at the same time, I think about whether if you, and we're looking at this picture on the screen, if you put Vladimir Putin in that chair, would we expect Donald Trump to lecture Vladimir Putin the way that he lectured Zelensky? And it's true. Ukraine is in a very, very tough spot. And it played out yesterday. And I think Zelensky really took the bait, as it were, and wanted to argue in a forum where you should never argue the deal points of anything.
And it was interesting, as you said. I don't know if we've ever seen anything like that, of course, play out in front of our own eyes. Typically, those tougher conversations, Brian, happen behind closed doors. What led to the two of them deciding that they wanted to have it out sort of in the public forum?
It's inexplicable why that would have occurred, and why the conversation went on as long as it did. I think the president could have said, hey, we've got a lot of disagreements here. We're going to have to work them out. Our staffs are going to have to work them out. But this mineral deal, you can see why Zelensky has a problem with signing a deal on minerals when there's no security guarantee. The Russians won't do anything. Well, what's to stop a sidebar agreement between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump along the lines of, hey, if we end up taking Ukraine, Mr. President, you'll have all the mineral rights you want. That's what Zelensky was thinking about in that moment, I'm quite sure. And so whether the Brits and the French can, eventually put soldiers in there to put together a peacekeeping group, we will see. But as of is going to go, we don't know whether this is going to result in Zelensky taking the decision to resign, can negotiate with the United States. We don't know whether this is a broken relationship, and maybe somebody like Klitschko, who is the mayor of Kyiv, former heavyweight boxer of the world, would do better in these kinds of negotiations. Who knows? Who knows who emerges after Zelensky? But some of the rhetoric that was applied to Zelensky could easily have been applied to Vladimir Putin. Putin has broken all kinds of agreements. And instead of recapping that and saying, hey, broken agreements everywhere, and Donald Trump referred to it. But once again, the president wants to litigate Biden, Hunter Biden, all these things that are in the past. Now it's time to try to find a solution to bring peace to that part of the world and security for us. Ukraine is not insignificant to the United States. It's the open door to the rest of Europe, to Poland that was under the aegis of the old Soviet Union, and the Baltic states. All of these things are important. And so Ukraine cannot be dismissed as this ineffective country. They have fought bravely, and yes, they've received tons of U.S. aid and European aid, and maybe disproportionately from the respect of, or as it respects Europe. But having said that, that the Ukrainian people are very brave. But when he refers to how many people have been lost in Ukraine, soldiers and that sort of thing, and he's lecturing Zelensky about that, you would hope that he would say to Putin, you've lost 700,000 soldiers. Isn't it time to stop this madness? And you would hope that those conversations are going on as well. But you would never, ever see Vladimir Putin sitting in that spot that Zelensky was arguing with the president of the United States. It would not happen, and Donald Trump would not try to have that kind of argument with Vladimir Putin, in my opinion.
And it was interesting, like you said, so many different aspects. You brought up the language barrier initially,
Yes.
that also wasn't a situation. Do you think if instead they were to speak through a translator,
Yes.
it might have gone a little bit smoother?
Absolutely. There's no question about it. I think a translator, an interpreter would have been able to convey Zelensky's feelings in a more nuanced way. But again, you're talking about somebody speaking in a second language with the top officials of the United States, and he's sitting there alone. I'm not feeling sorry for him. He's a very effective communicator. But it's true, he has thanked the United States many, many times. He's thanked the joint session of Congress. He's done that. And whether he said it in that meeting or not, who knows? I mean, we listened to it. He reiterated he's thanked the United States many times. And but here he is receiving a lecture from the president and the vice president, and I'm not sure that that moves the negotiations. And it also, going back to security considerations, it doesn't solve the problem of this president, or rather of Vladimir Putin, of his record over 2 decades. He doesn't tell the truth. I mean, the world knows that. And so that is why Zelensky is saying, hey, we need a little bit more than just signing an agreement and allowing some American workers come in with tractors and dig up rare minerals. It's much bigger than that. And defending our president, I think he was trying to say, hey, get us in there, get us working, and the Russians will not do anything. Sadly, the record of the Russians is at best suspect.
Let's talk about the response as well. After the meeting was over, of course, we saw it happen there in the Oval Office. I want to put that President Trump posted on his Truth Social site. He says, we had a very meaningful meeting without conversation under such fire and pressure. It's amazing what comes out through emotion. And I have determined that President Zelensky is not ready for peace if America is involved, because he feels our involvement gives him a big advantage in negotiations. I don't want advantage, I want peace. He disrespected the United States of America and its cherished Oval Office. He can come back when he's ready for peace. And I want to come back to the point where he says he's able to come back when he's ready for peace. There were other folks calling, as you mentioned briefly, for Zelensky to step down. Do you think that he's going to listen to any of that, or do you think the statement, I'm getting a lot of mixed signs from that statement that President Trump put out?
Well, I think everybody saw it as a mixed message. You saw what went on in the Oval Office. Then on Truth Social, he says this is what happens when you have a fiery rhetoric and all of that. But at the same time, he basically asked Zelensky to leave and come back some other time. The problem with that is that the war goes on. And this idea that we have an ocean between us and the rest of the world is fine, but it's also true that a missile goes right over an ocean. This is a different world now. And we know that from history and military history, which I've studied at great length, that appeasement of one side or another doesn't result in in moving the needle in terms of peace. We saw it before World War II. You had the British Prime Minister go to negotiate with Hitler and come home and say, "Oh, everything's going to be great." Hitler had a whole different plan, and so does Vladimir Putin.
Let's talk about the response as well. We have this current one up from President Trump, but also Zelensky spoke out also on his X account as well to reiterate what the thought process was after that meeting. We saw him do that exclusive interview on Fox News with Bret Baier. But he says this: we are grateful to the United States for all the support. I'm thankful to President Trump and Congress for their bipartisan support and the American people. Ukrainians have always appreciated this support, especially especially during these 3 years of full-scale invasion. And he also goes on to say, America's help has been vital in helping us survive. I want to acknowledge that despite the tough dialogue, we remain strategic partners, but we need to be honest and direct with each other to truly understand our shared goals. He was right. He has been thankful. He said it several times. I saw clips circulating of other times he's thanked the United States. What do you think about his response there? Of course, he still had that sit-down conversation on Fox News as well, trying to get that message out after that very heated debacle there in the Oval Office.
Well, I think that statement that he released was a diplomatic statement. And maybe if he could have articulated that in the Oval Office, that would have been helpful. But again, and we've chatted about that in this conversation, very tough to do in that kind of environment. And again, I think these tough discussions should happen behind the scenes. I'm all for transparency, but that isn't the way politics work in the real world. And so that reverberates around the world. And yes, America is supportive of nations that are in tough spots, but there has to be a strategic reason to do that. And in Ukraine, there's just no doubt about it. But this, and I also understand, probably from the administration's point of view, that making sure that we have a good relations with Russia and Vladimir Putin is important, because we do not want to see the continuation of this Russia, China, Iranian axis and North Korea. That's not helpful either. So I realize that the president is trying to thread a needle, but it's easy kind of to play out in the Oval Office how weak Ukraine is and how they wouldn't survive without us and all of that. That's just words, and it belies the fact that hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians have been killed, and it's important to remember that Vladimir Putin has into schools things that are crimes against humanity. And you would think that that should have been at least a piece of this discussion.
And so, as we're talking about this, we're taking a live look there at the White House. This contentious conversation, ultimately, President Volodymyr Zelenskyy left America. He went over, I want to put this tweet that we have as well, showing, this is from the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer. He says, it was an honor to welcome Zelenskyy to Downing Street and reiterate my unwavering support for Ukraine. I am determined to find a path that ends Russia's illegal war and ensures just a lasting peace that secures Ukraine's future sovereignty and security. This statement as well is going to continue to watch as the fallout happens from this meeting. We're now seeing the UK double down in their support of Ukraine. What are your thoughts on what this may mean later on?
Well, I think you're going to see the Europeans do exactly what the Prime Minister of Great Britain did. Because to this long history with what was the Soviet Union and now Russia, the plans of Russia have never changed, and the plans of Vladimir Putin have not changed. He would like to have a reconstruction of the old Soviet Union. Well, to do that, that involves Ukraine, it involves Poland, it involves countries, the Baltics, it involves countries that used to be aligned with the Soviet Union. And he wants a Ukraine that has a government that essentially reports to Moscow. And that's the truthful dynamic here. And so when in the Oval Office, all you heard was sort of this one-way speech about how Ukraine doesn't have the cards to deal with Russia and on. It also does not speak to the fact that the Russians are the aggressor. 3 years ago, they invaded Ukraine. You can't rewrite history. And the attempt by some people in the administration to rewrite history, there was a point where Trump said, well, maybe the Russians, violated agreements with Biden. I don't know. Of course he knows. Of course he knows. And so the idea, and I get where the President Trump is coming from in terms of saying, hey, we have to break Russia away from China and North Korea and Iran. I get that. But that's what makes this attempt at peace so important, because Ukraine is the buffer for Europe. And there's just no denying that, historically or otherwise.
And it has been as you said, over history, the relationship between Europe and was long marred for years. So let's talk about it. Moving forward, what's next for the U.S. and Russia after Putin sees the way that this meeting happened? Where do you think Putin and Trump's relationship is going to go here?
Moscow. I mean, this couldn't have gone any better for Vladimir Putin. The folks that are around him. This was a 100% win, but still every day the losses by the Russians in Ukraine are horrendous, and they're horrendous on the side of the Ukrainians as well. And that's the whole thing here: is the loss of life is staggering. But you know what? Let's look at history again. The Russians and the Soviets for years have always lost a lot of people. They lost a generation during World War II. Lost a generation, and they bounce back and they keep doing what they do. If we were suffering the kinds of losses, America, that we're seeing in Ukraine right now, either from the Russian side or the Ukrainian side, we would have found a way out of this a long time ago. But this is happening in a distant place, and to some extent, the President Trump does not think it affects America, and he said so. Big ocean, all that stuff. It does affect America. History tells us it affects America, and that's why I think this rhetoric needs to be really toned down by our administration, and get back to talking about finding peace there that's equal. The Ukrainians have to find a way to understand that they are not going to be in a period of peace for 2 years until Putin decides to ramp up an invasion again.
Brian, you're providing so much context. I hope you can stay with us here. We're going to take a 2-minute break. On the other side, I want to talk about the congressional response. We have some response from other lawmakers there in Washington, D.C. And let's talk and look ahead to Tuesday, because we know Trump will be addressing Congress. Stay with us. We're going to take a step away for a 2-minute break. I just want to bring back into the conversation now Brian Sobel. What are your thoughts on this overall? How is this going to affect Trump's relationship with Congress, knowing that he has that address that's coming up on Tuesday as well?
Well, sadly, this is one more divide between Republicans and Democrats. And I think on Tuesday, in his speech to the joint session of Congress, you're going to have one side of the aisle sitting on their hands or boycotting the speech, and you're going to have the other side cheering the president, and as one would expect. But Lindsey Graham said something there that your viewers should take note of. He told Zelenskyy, "Don't take the bait," and what he meant by that, and I mean, I take him at his word, is, hey, come in, be respectful, listen to the president, move on, make this minerals deal. We'll talk about security guarantees later. For whatever reason, Zelenskyy took the bait. But I think there were a lot of circumstances there that led into what became a show for the world that was not good. You do not want to see two presidents arguing in front of the media. And by the way, to J.D. Vance's point about the American media, there were a lot of international media there as well. This went around the world and did not play well with our allies in Europe. And so I get that Donald Trump is a business person. It's about making deals. But if you're on the firing line like Ukraine is, you have to accept that their president is going to have a lot of emotion. Every day he sees the casualty lists. We sit here in the United States right now. We're in really good shape in terms of where our warriors are around the world. But if you're in Ukraine, you've got missiles coming into your cities. You've got women and children and soldiers being killed. I would expect there would be passion. So I really blame whoever it was that put those two people in the Oval Office the way that they did. I just think it was a recipe for disaster. And guess what? It was a disaster.
And it was something that you said we were all able to watch on television live when it happened as they were having that conversation. So it's been interesting to see the played out of this situation. Of course, I know this isn't the end of it, but like we just touched on, Next week, Tuesday, in just a few days, Trump is going to officially address the joint session of Congress for the first time. It's going to be March 4th, but unlike traditional addresses, this will not be classified as a State of the Union, which I think there is somewhat confusion between the two when people hear that he's going to be addressing Congress. Brian, what can you tell us about what else we can expect to hear out of this joint address?
Well, first, because a new president is in office, the first speech is usually a joint session of Congress. It's just a speech. It's not the State of the Union. That comes next year, as it traditionally has in American history. And so I expect that Donald Trump will address a lot of the issues that we have been hearing about, DOGE and international issues and that sort of thing. I think his speechwriters, as we speak, are writing in this whole Zelenskyy situation in the Oval Office, and the president will once again explain why he feels like the minerals deal was important as a first step. And we take Lindsey Graham at his word that he was talking about the idea that security guarantees would come later. But again, what's the old line? It takes two to tango, and they're not dancing. And in fact, they're on both sides of the room. And so in these very hard negotiations, these things have to be played out behind closed doors. And I just don't think it's beneficial or healthy for us to have these kinds of scenes in the Oval Office. It's unsettling to our European allies. It's unsettling to a lot of Americans, frankly. And you look around the United States, lots of Ukrainian flags are flying because we as a country and many of our citizens have supported the Ukrainian people in their fight against the aggressor, the invaders. And if you can't paint that picture and say, okay, that happened, now let's have peace, then of course Zelenskyy or the Ukrainians are going to say, hey, have you forgotten what happened here?
Certainly. And we're going to be taking a close eye on it as we're listening into that speech to hear all that we can get out of it. I think it's also important to remark here, Brian, that Senator Alyssa Slotkin is going to be giving the Democratic response to his speech that he's going to give on Tuesday.
Yes.
What do you think we're going to hear from her?
I think you're going to hear something that's a more tempered version of what we saw from Bernie Sanders. I think there are a lot of upset Democrats. Remember, the administration just changed recently, right? And before that time, we had President Biden, and President Biden was in lockstep with members of Congress on the Democrat side of the aisle on the issue of Ukraine. And so there's a lot of raw emotion here. I've been covering politics for over 3 decades, and I call it as I see it. And I realize that there's some people who are listening to what I say today and think, boy, you're being a little tough on the president, President Trump. But there's no other takeaway from what we saw yesterday. It was not a good optic for the world. It wasn't a good optic for the United States, certainly not for for Zelenskyy and Ukraine. And so yesterday, we need to just kind of take an eraser and wipe it off the whiteboard and try to move on, because that wasn't good. And we'll see how this plays out now, Christina, in terms of whether Zelenskyy sends a different negotiating group to the United States or not. But it's a precarious time right now in that region of the world, and we just cannot take sides in that with respect to history. The history is Russia invaded, and we're trying to sort that out.
And it's going to be something that we're going to continue to follow very closely here on Live Now from Fox. Again, Brian Sobel, political analyst, we appreciate you as always for coming on to help us make sense of these major events that happen in our world. Thanks so much for being with us.
Christina, have a